On that day, 18 years ago, as we approached a grassy area between the hospital and the parking deck, a torrent of tears gushed out of me like a sea of pent-up emotion, lasting several minutes and punctuated by shortness of breath, sad noises, searing emotional pain, helpless, hopeless. My father stood nearby, stoic, dignified, and calm as always. But I knew an emotional tsunami had been unleashed within him as well. He stood there and let me expel the first waves of despair so I could drive us home. I was grateful for the quiet ride. It allowed us to start thinking about the day and how it would affect our lives from then on. We'd sat in the hospital waiting room for hours as my mother underwent surgery to remove a tumor near her liver. The middle of a saga that began with elevated liver enzymes following a routine physical and had led us to this point. Her exhausted surgeon had finally appeared in the waiting room to see us that afternoon. "I've got good news and bad news," he said simply. "The good news is that she survived the surgery and will be admitted to the ICU this evening. Unfortunately, we were unable to remove the tumor without jeopardizing the portal vein. That could have led to her passing out on the table. Of course, we understood what that meant. She was left with a ticking time bomb inside her that would eventually take her life and tear us apart. The next challenge would be telling this woman, who'd been married to my father for nearly 50 of her 74 years and had been his best friend for the entire time she'd been married to him. My story, however, is not about telling hers. We did, and she processed it on her own. She learned about her chances of survival with chemotherapy. She turned it down flat when she found out it was slim to none. She saw no reason to torture herself unless there was a fighting chance of a positive outcome, and with the regular replacement of a stent through her bile duct, she was able to travel with my father for a year, enjoying a new Lincoln Town car, which she joked she had to get sick to get, before things began to go downhill. The demon was given a name. Cholangiocarcinoma, or cancer of the bile ducts, was the cause, a very rare form of the disease. We witnessed a paradigm shift when my mother accepted her fate. Why me, she didn't ask. Why not me, she'd say. Was she any different from the rest of the world's victims of a similar fate? Life is a roller coaster of happy trails and bucking horses. Each of us is on a one-of-a-kind journey. No two are alike, just like snowflakes. As this most heartless of diseases took hold of her body, she and I began to laugh again. When we were helping her to the bathroom at night, she would pass gas or do something normal, and we would start laughing like it was ridiculous. I'm not sure my father ever understood when I returned to her room laughing with her. Her sense of humor was radiant and contagious. For so long, she'd appeared to be in perfect health as the stent did its job of allowing bile to pass through a liver. Hospital visits were made and tolerated, whether for stent replacement or another cancer-related issue. As time passed, one event stood out from the rest. When her hospice nurse came to see her that afternoon, she vomited bile. I'd never seen anything like it before, and I was thankful to God for the hospice nurse's presence. I followed an ambulance to the hospital after it was summoned. I arrived before the ambulance and joined her doctor in the emergency room. He told me that she was probably dying. When the staff member asked, "And what is wrong with your mother?" I went to the emergency check-in area and began giving Mom's information. "She's dying," I said, as tears began to fall, and I sat there processing the question. With that, she stood up and led me to a side room where I could be alone. I called one of my closest friends to inform her of the situation. As soon as I hung up the phone, a nurse appeared with a cold, refreshing ginger ale. I've never been to a hospital where there wasn't plenty of it. It's truly magical. I'd been drinking it and thinking for quite some time when my friend appeared in the doorway. I was overjoyed to see her. I was completely unprepared for what I saw when I finally got to see Mom. I opened the curtain to the alcove she was waiting in while being taken to her room. She was staring up with her eyes wide open, but she couldn't see anything. Later, A doctor informed me that it was a brainstem stroke from which people do not recover. She was deafeningly silent. That night, and every night after that, I stayed in her room, whether on a cot or in a big chair, praying, sleeping, talking to my father during his visits, and of course, advocating for her, as you must when a loved one is in the hospital. My brother was preparing to fly out of Montana. I did not pray for complete healing during my time in her room. I hoped that my mother would recover so that she and my brother could say their final goodbyes. I prayed nonstop for him and her. Finally, his arrival date arrived. My father went to the airport to meet him. While I waited for them, our minister arrived, and he and I were chatting in the hallway outside my mother's room when my father and brother exited the elevator. We waited while they went into her room. My father then appeared at the door and said, "I think you'd better come in." Ralph, our minister, and I entered to find my mother alert and talking to her son with a big smile on her face. My simple request has been granted. She'd worked hard to prepare for her last visit with her son. God truly works in mysterious ways, and He's answered my prayer. I was numb. My mother was in her final weeks of life and did not want to die in a hospital, so we brought her home, complete with a hospital bed. The wonderful hospice workers placed her in the den and showed me how to insert medication into her IV. After watching television dramas about people getting air in their veins from shots, etc., I was terrified of this. She claimed that because she was my mother, this would never happen. She trained me well, and I learned that what happens on TV is not always reality. My brother and mom had a wonderful visit, and they talked and talked. I guess God didn't consider the brainstem stroke to be an impediment. Things went downhill with a vengeance after my brother left, and the hospice nurse had to deal with her becoming impacted and a slew of other issues as the cancer demon began its final act. At times, we had to call in a nurse for assistance. I had taken time off under the Family Leave Act to be there full-time. As someone slowly dies, it appears that they reach a point where they're caught between two worlds. My mother started doing this. The nurses who cared for her took notes for me so that I wouldn't miss anything unusual that was going on. One of the nurses would occasionally get goosebumps. I was 2 floors above the den when I heard Mother call out Earl, the name of her late brother. She had apparently seen him and wanted to get his attention. She repeatedly called out his name. During one of these goosebump moments, the room felt like a massive spiritual embrace. Mom invited me to accompany her into the wavy light. I exited the room at that point. I was dealing with her impending loss. Her nurse later told me that Mom had told her that she hates leaving because Dad and I would be so sad. When I returned to her room, she looked up and said, "No, she won't be able to come with me, as if told." She also appeared to communicate with her late sister. Mom said her sister was nearby and invited her to come pick blackberries with her like they used to when they were kids. "He's coming, but I don't know when, and I need to get out of here," she once said. "Allow me to stand up so he can see me." She wanted to go outside and look at the birds because she'd seen birds with names. "Are you ready to go?" I asked as she told me to give away her clothes. "Yes," she replied. "Yes," she said again when I asked if she'd seen where she was going. I asked what it was like, and the only word she could utter was nature. Her voice sounded hoarse, and she found it difficult to speak. She mentioned a wavy light and said her sister was in it. She stated that she wished to accompany her but was afraid to do so. I told her not to worry. She also saw someone named Peggy, but I've never figured out who she was talking about. She stated that she's ready to accompany them and knows that everything will be fine, but she's concerned about my father and me. I assured her that we would be fine and that I would look after Dad. Mother announced that she was leaving that day. She stated that nature was all around her and that she wished to return home. She stated that her sister was with a man. They wanted her to come out into the light, but she was afraid. She said it would be fine soon and that she was leaving. She said she was ready to be with them, and as she drifted off, the last thing she said was "Mother." Silence woke me up around 2 a.m. I knew she'd left. I checked and was upset to see her eyes wide open. First, I called the hospice nurse. During his mother's illness, father suffered a minor stroke. I wanted the nurse to be present before telling him. She arrived quickly and assumed command. It was all God's doing. Mom and I had found peace. It wasn't until later that I remembered my mother telling me about her mother's death. Family members had gathered at her bedside, where she'd been in a coma for some time. She awoke in bed, telling them that she'd made peace with God and that her brother, Oscar, was waiting for her and that she would accompany him. She passed away at that point. My mother died before I was aware of the concept of approaching death awareness. Her hospice nurses recommended books like Final Gifts by Maggie Callanan and Patricia Kelly, both hospice workers, which detailed many similar incidents with the dying. As I read that book, I realized I had witnessed something fundamental in the dying process and that being a part of it had been a blessing.